Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance member webinar. And thanks to everyone in the audience, as always, for joining us and for your ongoing partnership. If you happen not to be an Alliance member, give me a call, send me an email. We need you on board. And I know you're tired of me saying that, but do it. Let's talk. We are so thrilled to be joined today by Scott Corley. He's joined us before, so I don't know if you all were part of the last meeting where Scott was with us, but he is the Executive Director of the American Task Force for Innovation. No, that's not right. Task Force for American Innovation, excuse me. And he's also partner and co-founder of the policy firm Corley and Pipes. And Scott is going to speak with us about the outlook for bills that really could have, I think dramatic might be an understatement, effect on US science and technology. I would say particularly in the technological arena, but in both. And speaking of the USICA, the US Innovation and Competition Act, and the NSF for the Future Act, and companion legislation to that one that's about energy. As usual, if you wouldn't mind typing your questions into the Q&A box or the chat as we go along, we'll pose them when we get to that point of today's session. Scott, thank you as always for everything. And let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Ellie. Ellie, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, just making sure. You know, if I start to roll, I might not stop and then you will be doing this. So first off, thank you and your team. I mean, Research America does such a great job keeping everyone informed, staying focused on, you know, advancing issues and thinking through ways to creatively, you know, present and really drive home the importance of making research a focus for the, you know, foreseeable future. And we're not looking for sort of a one-off, one-time change in the way that Congress thinks about not only the authorizations of these programs, but also the funding. We're looking at long-term sustained increases in the amount of investment we're making across the board in the research space, federally funded research, what economists would refer to as primarily public good activities, where, you know, you have gaps and you don't necessarily always have a profit motive to take those first steps. And, you know, even beyond the first steps, the interaction that continues between, you know, research that's, you know, developing into perhaps products or other types of things that improve society, they do continue to rely on government input, on help in terms of, you know, having scale to do certain types of research and experimentation. It's just such a deeply interactive relationship between our S&T enterprise and, you know, the private sector, public sector. It's hard for most average people to really understand, you know, how critical it is that the US and the USG in particular lead the way. And so, again, I think just as a broader point, Research America, our colleagues within other organizations have really beat this drum a long time, and we're on the threshold of actually seeing some real movement here. So thank you for having me today. Ellie, how would you want to proceed in terms of talking about these bills? Do you want to talk about House? Do you want to talk about Senate? Do you want to talk about the dynamics that are occurring between the two chambers as we speak?
Yeah, you know, I'd love to start just with a rundown on what's happening kind of as we speak. Mm-hmm. And then what do you foresee happens between the House and the Senate to get to goal? And as you said, these are authorizing bills. So how do you get to funding?
Yeah, it would be an ongoing question. I mean, first, I would say today, and we were just discussing this with you and your colleagues, they're having a vote on the NSF of the Future and DOE Office of Science, or DOE Science for the Future Act. Those two bills are on suspension, which for those of you who aren't steeped in sort of DC congressional process, it typically a suspension vote is for an issue that is considered non-controversial. these are bills that really ramp up funding for both the National Science Foundation as well as the DOE Office of Science. Just in the Office of Science alone, the House Science Committee has put forward recommendations, authorizations. As Ellie said, these are not the spending amounts. That's a separate piece of legislation that flows through the appropriations process. But they're increasing by nearly 25% the amount of money that will be spent at Office of Science. The increases for NSF are also very significant and sustained over a long period of time. I mean, at Office of Science, for example, their basic research increases by 2026 will nearly double the annual budget as compared to what was appropriated in FY21. So it is a significant focus and shift. And I think, to Ellie's point, that suspension vote will occur. It will pass. Both bills will pass, House Science bills. There is no plan to combine these bills, and that is an important fact when you look at the Senate, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's also a component of this that has to do with competition internationally, and there's a focus on China, of course, today. And I think it's an uncomfortable relationship we have with that topic. It's important that we give substance and meaning politically to what these bills mean. And when I talk about the Senate in a moment, I'm going to talk about, sort of the other half of a dynamic that needs both halves to be working together. Yeah. The House half of this is really about the integrity of the current structure we use for federally funded S&T research. It's about making sure it's workable. Basically, it's the credibility side. That's what we're seeing from the House. And it's not that there aren't parallels in the Senate. The Senate process is much more driving the other half of what needs to happen. If you're going to have a surge in interest like we've seen, you have to sell politically, and you have to have a group of players in the right position to guarantee funding behind that selling. So sellability from the Senate and credibility from the House is how I would break it down if you're trying just to quickly summarize in your mind these two halves. And that will also help explain some of the tension that has already arisen between the two chambers over their approaches. The only other thing I would say about the House, we are waiting for a House Foreign Affairs companion to some of the, again, competition issues with China, security issues with respect to other countries where we see ourselves in competition, or we see either the entrance of individuals or an exodus of technology to their markets. Those security measures will come out of foreign affairs primarily. That has a much less clear path. And I think our thinking right now is they may not be able to resolve the foreign affairs issues in a way that it will allow them to go into a suspension vote. And the ideal would be you pass the NSF and DOE science bills on suspension, you pass the foreign affairs bill on suspension as well, and that's 2/3 of the Congress, which is very rare in a nearly 50-50 House that would have to vote. The problem with the foreign affairs bill, and this doesn't specifically relate to anything science and research related, is that dynamic of China. The House is far more, the spectrum of views in the House tend to be broader. You wouldn't expect that. The Senate, they all represent whole states. You'd think, well, senators must have broader views. They do, as a group, have narrower views. Individually, they have broader views. But as a group, they tend to be more homogenous in the Senate. The House, because it's so parochial and based on smaller sets of populations, you have these broad views. So, for example, Greg Meeks, the chair of Foreign Affairs, has a district that adjoins AOC. She has very strong views about not entering another Cold War, as she put it, with China, and doesn't want bills that mention China specifically, make it about China. I don't think any of us are looking to have that kind of conflict, but there's a view from the other side of the aisle that that's just burying your head. There's a real competition with China that's already well underway. It's it's very hot. And while, you know, we're not in a Cold War situation, I would say, I think there's disagreement over whether or not you need to focus on China in legislation. That's shown up in the Foreign Affairs bill. The bill that Mr. Meeks put forward didn't mention the word China in it.
Right.
And that has caused Mike McCall, the ranking member, to say he will not support it. So we're waiting on Foreign Affairs to try and figure out what they're going to put forward, whether or not they're going to go for an actual vote or just work a bill at committee and then wait for negotiations with the Senate.
So Scott, can I interrupt just to
yeah,
ask a question,
yeah,
to swing
okay.
back? Is the reason that that's important in the context of something like USICA because some of that's built into USICA, or do you feel that, so that's the problem, is that there's a disconnect between the Senate and the House?
Absolutely. Well,
Okay.
it's a disconnect between the sellability that Schumer has chosen. The
I see.
majority leader in the Senate, a Democrat from New York, has made it very clear that this is about competing with China.
Right.
And because the Senate tends to be the tougher chamber to get movement in, it's much more of when you're moving towards spending like this, when you're taking something that in the past, everyone has basically said, yeah, I agree with, we need more science, that's great. No one ever wants to step up. And if they have, you know, let's say they're on a scale of 1 to 10 amount of energy, they can allocate that 1 through 10 to different things. Very rarely do we find a large number of members willing to allocate their political energy in the Senate or the House to
Right.
science and research funding. There's a difference between someone agreeing with you and someone being willing to push. And so Schumer has used China and the fact that it is on the mind of both parties. Both parties have concerns about either human rights or, you know, currency manipulation or whatever. He's used that very effectively to create a moment in the Senate where they were able to do something that is very rare, and that is pass a bill within an open amendment process on the floor. And it was tortured, but it includes China, and you cannot negotiate the Senate bill without a parallel package from the House on China.
That makes a lot of sense. You just cannot move forward to conference without some of those provisions.
No, it would be incredibly important that the House have a voice in that, because the Senate will insist on maintaining those provisions. And the reason they will do that is they can probably go down and tell you which members will drop off when the bill is finalized out of conference. So again, for those of you who don't know the process, they'll conference differences, then they have to go back and vote again, because it's technically the constitutional way, right? I mean, you can't just agree with a small group, even though you voted once, and then that becomes the thing you send to the president. They have to vote again on the unified measure. And if you don't have, the Senate will insist on their language if the House doesn't speak in terms of its own views. And without something to negotiate, frankly, they won't finish this work. If the House were to, for example, say, well, we can't do anything on China, if that were, as the Progressive Caucus has pushed for, the position of the House, all of this effort would die. It just wouldn't go anywhere. They cannot move USICA, the Senate bill, in the Senate without the China provisions. They don't have the votes.
Wow. Could they bifurcate? Could they pull out that, you know, agree with the House to pull out those security measures, but with an agreement to negotiate on that? And, or are you just saying that all the energy would go out of USICA? I mean, people would pivot away from S&T?
If the belief was that they weren't going to deal with China, they could not move separated bills. I think they will try to break it into smaller pieces, Ellie. I think they'll try and deal, and this is from, you know, for example, the Pelosi office said they want this in smaller pieces. The Science Committee deliberately passed 2 bills, not 1, even though these 2 bills are designed to complement one another. There's a tension between that credibility question. The House Science Committee is very focused on, we need this to be credible, we need it to work, which of course we want that to work.
Yes.
The Senate, they are focused on that, but the people who are behind the bill, who are driving the bill, who got the bill passed, There's no way this bill passes if it's only a commerce bill. None. This has to be Schumer. And Schumer is the only person that can get it done in the way he got it done and going forward. He's also probably the only person who can guarantee that these bills aren't just promises that are empty, that we're going to get our money.
So you're going to get the funding for it.
Absolutely. So he needs to sell constantly. He's less concerned with tradition. He's less concerned with even legitimate, like, this is outside the scope of NSF, what you're proposing, and could damage NSF's ability to continue the research and the other incredibly important scientific activity of the foundation going forward. Like, he's less concerned with that. And the House committee is very concerned with that. And what you see is this human dynamic starting to enter where people are actually upset. If you listen to them talk, there's an emotional element to this. And that was the only other thing I was going to say before I open it up and see if you or others have questions. We are finally in the place where we want to be. And this sort of tension between the credibility and the sellability of the issue. Sellable is politics. Credible is policy. That's an oversimplification, but again, if you're just trying to generally understand this, that's what, you can't get so focused on credibility that you pass on the sellability, because you can never get it passed, any bill passed without it. You can't be so focused on selling and getting it passed that you pass something that's terrible or won't work. And these two sides are going to have to finally realize that each other that's the way to get this done. They're going to have to come together in an honest and peaceful way and stop trading barbs in the press.
Right.
It's like people who have been waiting in the audience of Price is Right their whole lives, right? I just want to get on stage. They finally get on there and you're watching, and it's this sort of moments of pain, like, no, don't do that. No, don't put that price on that product. Like, it's like watching that happen before your eyes. It's really hard in this environment when there is so much interest for people not to become a little parochial, a little too insular in their thinking, a little too proud in terms of their authorship to make changes. And one of the big pushes from us, from our task force, from you all, and from everyone in the community is going to be helping to remind them to stay calm, that this is a moment that we may never see again. Yeah. You cannot miss it. So I would say that tension is going to continue to be a potential death knell to this. We had to be really, really vigilant in trying to encourage them to not find their differences, but to find where they have things in common and then work on their differences. And right now they are very focused on their differences. And the presumption of having things in common is a dangerous place to start a negotiation. You want to start with what you can dispense with, then move to this is where we're different, so that you've built some goodwill. So that's really the biggest, broadest picture I can offer, Ellie. I hope that's helpful.
It is. And, I think one of the things that's tough probably for the science community is if we could broaden the conversation to the fact that economies are maturing all over the world, and we want that. We want healthy competition, and we want to be in the mix. That it's not just China, it's Germany, and it's these developing economies, it's India, it's, but there's, in the science community, there's also open science and collaboration and not creating this kind of xenophobic specter around S&T. So we're in a tough spot. But let me ask you one question, then I'm going to turn to the audience. So the S&T Action Committee that I know you're familiar with, and I think we'll put it in the chat for anyone who is not familiar with this effort. They're trying to secure a doubling of S&T funding relative to GDP over, I think, 5 years. And that's a bigger lift than, USICA, which is really NSF, as you mentioned, NSF focus, and there's some energy work. But in your view, is there an argument, and I think COVID is an example of an existential threat. Is there an argument that could propel that kind of a sustained 5-year effort, that we're not eating each other's lunch? It's not a cannibalizing thing, but that we really make the case for dramatic S&T funding for our future as a nation and the global community? Or do we need this competitiveness with China message?
Well, I think if you're going to break through, this is the challenge of a hyper-partisan environment, where, you know, I don't like sports analogies. I do think there's a little bit of a bias built into them, but I think everyone can understand the idea of former opponents who come onto a team, or even in business, or, you know, in science, if you are in a competitive research environment, all of a sudden you've got a researcher from a team that you were racing against. Think about the change that happens in you when you say, like, hey, you know, now they're on my team. All the stuff that you said about them before, I'm sure it wasn't personal if it's science, but in sports, it's very personal, right? This guy's a crook, he's a criminal, or this woman, you know, she's, you know, cheating with drugs or whatever, you know, it's like, all of a sudden they can do no wrong. They're on your team now, right?
Right.
That's what hyper-partisanship brings to it. And the reason why our messaging, I think, falls a little flat isn't that we're not making really credible arguments about the very nature of what this means for the country. It's that if one sort of, you know, hegemonic figure, in the idea of hegemony being like other people attach their views to that view, like it's just a simple path politically to, oh, if so-and-so says it, then that's where I am. We see voting structures in Congress that are very similar to that. One person from the state on a committee of authorization votes that way. All the other members of the state vote that way because he's on the committee or she's on the committee.
Right.
So I think what we've run into is there's spending involved, right? And it's, if a Democrat's proposing it, a Republican would say, yeah, well, I mean, science is great, but, you know, we don't need science for science sake, or there's smarter ways, or if this was truly valuable, then, you know, the business community would be doing it because there would be profit behind, you know, like that's these sort of public good deniers. It's a very thin argument, but you don't need it to be a thick argument. Thin is fine if your only goal is, oh yeah, well, I'm on this side of the aisle. They don't like it. It lets me trash the other side of the aisle. Therefore, I'm against it. And so our spending increases are always met with, yeah, I get it. I think you're right. But we never see real action because either the question is put forward and what I just said happens, or the question is just never put forward because everyone sees what will happen.
I see.
The reason you have to have this sort of China piece, it's bipartisan, it's a top 5 issue, it's in the news all the time. People are concerned about this idea of conflict with China, whether a hot war, cold war, whatever. It's very sellable and it cuts through that partisanship. You cannot say, oh, I'm worried about spending in the context of China, because someone will come back and say, so you don't care about our children? You don't care about, you know, human rights? You know, like you
jobs, whatever.
Through it very easily. That's why.
That's why
I think it's important.
Well, let me, Terry, join us. And I know that there are questions from the audience. I see that. So.
Yes. So actually jumping off of the question about China, someone wants to know, are there Russia provisions or any kind of information regarding other countries with problematic export controls or relationships? Are we concerned about protecting against other possibly problematic relationships?
Yeah, I think a lot of the provisions are written more broadly than just China, even though the arguments made are along those sellable lines. But China is really the only one that gets named very specifically, unless you're talking about like cybersecurity, then you would see a lot of Russia, but that's not really been a major factor in these discussions. There's cybersecurity bills, and they would do most of that in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is an annual bill. But I think the person asking this question is making a very valid point, and it's how we'll probably combat this. Let's not be anti-Chinese just because we're worried about what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, and that's a fine line. I think that's honestly what the Progressive Caucus is getting at. I don't approach life that way. I think you have to have long and honest discussions for people to be comfortable. I don't believe we can kind of just say, let's just not talk about it, be fine. But I understand. I think their point is very valid. And so one of the things we'll do is just start talking about China today, just like it was Japan in the 80s. It will be India tomorrow. It will be an African country that's gained stability and has the kind of economic, situation that would allow them to emerge very quickly. I mean, it could be any number of things going forward. Our goal shouldn't be to worry about something that is present today alone. It should be to build a system that allows us to compete no matter who emerges. And that is probably, and we want to talk about competition. We are not going to get in a hot war with China. We will all die. And we've talked about this. Ellie and I were just on a call where we talked about this. That's a dumb thing. And I don't think we have anyone dumb enough at all in government. You say, oh, that's funny, everyone makes jokes about dumb people in government. It's not true. They're very smart people in government. We're not going to be in a hot war. So when we're talking about competing, the only instrument we really have, whether people say it or not, in their hyperbolic statements, is economics. Yeah. And the S&T piece of the economic picture is the one the USG has the most control over.
Great. Another question that's come in, there's been a lot of talk in the press about earmarks. Earmarks maybe not directly related to science. Is this going to be a factor in passage? What are your thoughts on earmarks this year? They're back.
I think they're figuring it out. I think it should be an instrument for nonprofit organizations going forward. I think it's very important. I think earmarks scare people because of the bad name they get. And it's like anything else. It's like lobbying. You have a few people who have these tremendous scandals like an Abramoff, and all other lobbyists are thought to be people like that, when that is, I've never known a lobbyist who tries to cheat that didn't get caught. They watched too many movies growing up, or they didn't really work on the Hill and not understand how much we talked to each other when we were on the Hill, and how we would talk about, oh, this person gives me the creeps. Usually like they were just creepy. It wasn't like, hey, they're trying to give me money. And so I think it's absurd to assume that, we're just kind of in a situation of having to take, I do think, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. We were talking about outside of lobbying. What was the specific thing? I apologize.
I love it. It was earmarks.
It was earmarks.
Oh, yeah, earmarks.
Conversation
Yes. Sorry. I was like, how was I bringing that back to Abramoff? Sorry. Oh, wow. That's been a rare occasion for me. The earmark side of this has this sort of negative connotation attached to it, right? And it's going to take a while, especially on the Republican side, for them to fully embrace. But we want each city, state, government to be able to make a request directly to the Congress, and as the Constitution suggests, have Congress determine the allocation of funds. And simply because Ted Stevens put money in an age of weird hubris on the part of appropriations cardinals, simply because Ted Stevens put money in for a bridge to nowhere, doesn't mean that the earmark process should then be left to unelected people in bureaucratic positions in government. There is always a human factor, always. And so you want an accountable human factor. And again, Stevens is a great example. He literally put in a bridge to nowhere, got called out for it, and that started an investigation that led to this man resigning. Now, sadly, he passed away shortly after, but that's the end of that. We didn't need to go all the way the other direction, take all that out of the hands of Congress. And there's one last point to understand. You cannot discipline members of Congress like you used to be able to do with earmarks. Every member of Congress who asks for something for their district is then in a position where they have to listen and not act crazy at the end of the year when we're talking about must-pass bills. Right. And the amount of partisanship that's grown since they ended earmarks is not a coincidence. It is an absolute result of the leadership of Congress having absolutely no tools for trying to control the desire of members of Congress who are not in leadership to throw monkey wrenches or to make little points for the purpose of parochial interest back home.
What a great point. And, I will add in terms of S&T, my understanding is that really bricks and mortar labs, there's some availability through HRSA, but no earmarking in NIH. I don't think any NSF earmarking, but through HRSA, there is some lab and infrastructure possibilities. Can we hold you for a couple more minutes, Scott?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, we do have one more question. This builds a little bit on what you were saying before, Scott, about the lobbying and how the influences. What's your sense of where the business and industry communities are on these bills? Is there anything you can share with us about that?
Yes, I think there's a lot of interest. Industry-wise, especially the industries that are sort of in the industry of the future category, AI, 5G, quantum computing. The companies that do sort of pure research in that space are very active already. I would say most of the tech companies, they're under assault, a weird kind of assault right now. There's efforts to, introduce antitrust legislation against 5 platform companies that's bipartisan. So there's a little distraction in there. But I do think, for example, the CHIPS Act funding, the $52 billion for semiconductor research and for locating manufacturing, that's an actual appropriation within USICA. They actually appropriated the money.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's going to, require. I mean, there won't be blue slipping on USICA as a result. They'd have to have a point of order.
Blue slipping?
Where like committees say that's in my jurisdiction. No.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that's pretty much the only guaranteed money. So you have obviously all the major semiconductor companies, especially the ones that do automotive chip making because of the shortage of chips for cars. The CHIPS Act is really an example of something that's kind of outside the basic space, even though there's basic research money, there's actually significant money into research accounts. But it's one of those examples of where you start looking at what's the hub, what's the choke point in architecture, both software and hardware for technology, and it is through the microchip. And whoever controls that, I think is basically in the driver's seat on almost everything from 5G on out. The market for that type of technology has changed significantly over 20 years. Intel is no longer the predominant player that they once were. In fact, they cannot make a 3 nanometer chip. The only company in the world that can make the 3 nanometer, although I think Samsung just announced they're going to do one too, is a place called TSMC, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which was this sort of 20 years ago, this little tiny company that made chips for people who weren't on the cutting edge of technology. They didn't manufacture their own. You design, they built. And that model, with the advent of iPhones and other things, the ubiquity of technology in our hands became the predominant model. That, combined with subsidies from Taiwan, has made them the #1 chips manufacturer in the world. And that woke up the Department of Defense, that woke up the USG, especially when Intel missed being able to deliver on their 5 nanometer chip, which showed that they did not have the capacity in their current facilities, and they can't afford really to just do a pure upgrade at a cost-effective price.
And that bears on jobs
Yeah.
for us in the United States. It bears on so much.
It does.
Okay, let me ask you one more question. This one, you can just nix it and just, I'm not answering. But if you look at the task force, American Innovation, an amazingly diverse task force, right? So you have industry, you have science, you have all in the physical sciences. I mean, you have real diversity there. Is there consensus at TFAI, within TFAI, on what they could agree to across these bills and across the foreign policy piece, where there would they sign on to a strange bedfellows letter where they bring in defense industry and they bring in Research America? Or do you have a diversity of thought within the alliance?
I think the feelings are pretty diverse, but not in conflict. It's just in a matter of emphasis. We have some semiconductor companies who are very focused on chips, and so whatever gets that there, they're going to trust the science side. They're going to trust the NSF and DOE Office of Science, and our universities and organizations like yours to say yes, that will work. If there were like a choice between chips or having something where Schumer said, I walk away, I think the professional side of lobbying would take over, including for me. Under no circumstances can Schumer be the one that walks away from this. We cannot get it done without him. It won't happen. It just won't. And so I think I'd go back to the question that we were talking about before. What is it that's happening and how does this come together? It can't be the case that those of us who are steeped in the accounts, those of you who are living this when you apply for grants, or perhaps you're in collaborations with national labs or whatever, can't be the case that you're looking this close to the issue. You cannot do that. You have to step away and see this that you're worried about never happens if this bigger picture of how to maintain pressure through the sellability of concern, right? That's what politics is about. If you're not concerned, you're not voting on it, or it's a post office and no one cares. So you have to maintain the concern, as uncomfortable as that might get. You have to maintain the person who can drive the concern, Schumer, and we can't pick sides in that. And so I think we need to be supportive of whatever organic process begins to emerge between the two sides. And the only thing that's on us is, as we're talking to staff, we're going to have to continue to say, yeah, I hear you. Yeah, that is ridiculous. Remember, though, this is our moment. So
this is our moment.
This is, you know, what about this? What about they are here where you are on the new directorate numbers? They're here. I mean, like getting into, you know, why you were in agreement, reminding constantly,
right,
not to fumble the football or, you know, screw up the project proposal or whatever analogy you want to use on the basis of, you know, these very narrow concerns. They are important, but we've got 8 years of funding. We can fix in the next year's, you know, whatever act. I mean, we can do more going forward to cure problems. We cannot stop this momentum to cure those problems if we expect to get any money this year.
Well, that's really important. It's a bitter pill if we, you know, because there's some poison pills in USICA that people are very upset about, but I hear what you're saying, and it's something for all of us to think about really carefully. Scott, thank you so much. And I have housekeeping, if I can remember it, and if I can't, Terry can. And that is that we have a closed door Alliance member meeting next week. Closed, just Alliance members, which is why you should join if you're not Alliance member. With Cheryl Lou Santos, Mark Rotner, you know the names, 21st Century Cures 2.0 key staff. And we're going to be having a discussion with them about that bill, about the RFI on ARPA-H, and the other provisions, a lot of important provisions that they are proposing in their discussion draft. So, and other cool meetings to come. Keep up with Mary's weekly letter and with these meetings. And thanks again. Say goodbye there.